What's good, boys? Welcome back to another video over on the BDGE Dynasty channel. Hopefully you guys are excited for today's video. What we're going to be talking about today is actually how we should be moving forward with some of these second-year players at the wide receiver and at the running back position, because we know as we approach these rookie drafts here in 2024, if you want to add players to the team, you got to cut players from the roster as well. I'm going to tell you guys who you should be keeping, who might be on the roster bubble, and who you should be cutting as well. But before we get into the video, you know what we have to do. We have to tuck those shirts in, baby. All right, so the first thing that we need to talk about is we need to talk about context. Obviously, if you play in different styles of leagues, the way that you are going to construct your roster is going to be different. So what we are going to be talking about today is from a 12-team super flex PPR start 10 type of lens. If you play in those types of leagues, this is going to be applicable for you. If you play in an 8-man league or a 14-man league, some of this information you may need to decipher and kind of choose what is applicable for you. But I will say it is from a 12-team super flex PPR start 10 type of format. So as you guys can see on the screen right now, Gut has done a wonderful job creating some graphics for you guys. So thank you, Gut. You guys can see right now, there are some players that I feel like should not need to be addressed in today's video. These are the obvious second-year keeps for your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams. These are going to be players like Puka Nacua, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Jordan Addison, Zay Flowers. Then when you look at the running backs like Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Tajay Spears, Devon Achane, we don't need to address these guys. If you have them on your roster, you are obviously keeping them. That is obvious. But we are going to be talking about some of the other players. So I think what we'll do is we'll hop into the running backs first. We'll talk about the guys that we're keeping. We'll work our way down to the guys that we're cutting. So when you're making these decisions, these are the running backs right now that I would consider keeping on my Dynasty Fantasy Football rosters. We have the running backs like Zach Charbonnet, Kendre Miller, Chase Brown, Keaton Mitchell, Roschon Johnson, Tank Bigsby, and Jaleel McLaughlin. And I'll kind of give you a little bit of reasoning why I'm keeping each of these guys. We'll start at Zach Charbonnet. This is a guy who got day 2 draft capital. In fact, he was drafted in the 2nd round by the Seattle Seahawks. We know that he's going to remain heavily involved in this offense. This is kind of a co-backfield between Zach Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker. They drafted him to be that. He is going to remain heavily involved. We should be keeping Zach Charbonnet. That's going to take us over to Kendre Miller, another guy who was drafted on day 2, 3rd round draft capital here. And when you look at what the New Orleans Saints were able to put on the field in that running back room in 2023, Jamal Williams obviously being signed was a major disappointment for the New Orleans Saints. I think Kendre Miller is the guy who is going to profile as the running back 2 in this lineup moving forward. I also think due to Alvin Kamara's age, this is potentially a guy who could find himself as the starting running back eventually. We obviously want to keep Kendre Miller because of that. I'm also going to skip. I'm going to go down to Tank Bigsby because this was the last guy in the 2023 draft that was drafted with day 2 draft capital. Now his season seems to be a lot more negative than the other twos. It does feel like a lot of people who drafted Tank Bigsby are out on Tank Bigsby now. I mean, rightfully so. This is a guy who only received 50 carries during the year for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I will say that with the recent coach speak with Doug Peterson saying that he wants to kind of lighten the load on Travis Etienne and maybe get Tank Bigsby a little bit more involved, I do think that there is a case for Tank Bigsby to be on the fringe running backs, but I do think I am going to be keeping him at least for one more year. The draft capital, the coach speak, some of these things, I'm just willing to hold Tank Bigsby a little bit longer. But let's get into Chase Brown, because Chase Brown is a guy who I think saw his stock rise a lot during the 2023 season, and more specifically this offseason when the Cincinnati Bengals traded Joe Mixon to the Houston Texans. I think you look at the competition that he has in this backfield now. Obviously, they signed Zach Moss. We do got to admit that that is some weaker competition for Chase Brown. If you like Chase Brown, Mixon leaving is going to be opening 67% of the carries and 11% of the targets in this running back room for the Cincinnati Bengals offense. Definitely a guy that you should be considering keeping on your rosters. Now, Keaton Mitchell and Roschon Johnson, almost opposite players, but kind of the same situations going forward, in my opinion. You look at Roschon, obviously people had high expectations for that Bears backfield. He really didn't do anything. And then when you look at Keaton Mitchell, obviously there were no expectations for him, and then he exceeded those expectations going into 2023. But as I look at the future outlook for both of these guys, obviously the Baltimore Ravens have signed Derrick Henry. The Chicago Bears have signed DeAndre Swift. And it feels like both of these guys at best are going to be complementary pieces to those starting running backs. I think the youth and the upside of both of these players is keeping them as players that I want to keep on my Dynasty Fantasy Football teams moving forward. But I do think that those two guys' outlooks are not as good as some of the guys that we've talked about in this tier so far. And that is going to take me to our last player in this keep tier, and that is going to be Jaleel McLaughlin for the Denver Broncos. And Jaleel McLaughlin, another guy who didn't have any expectations coming into the 2023 season. He obviously came in, he was behind Samaje Perine, behind Javonte Williams, but he found a role in this Denver Broncos offense. And I think one of the interesting things about Jaleel McLaughlin is he is going to be the only running back under contract for the Denver Broncos past the 2024 season. And like I mentioned, he did do well when he was complimenting Javonte Williams at times. So I do think that we should be keeping Jaleel McLaughlin. It's also a guy who averaged 6.2 fantasy points per game in his limited opportunities during the 2023 season. Now that is going to take me to the fringe running backs, guys that I am okay with you keeping, probably okay with you cutting as well. I think these guys have a little bit more question marks and murkier situations moving forward, but the list of guys is going to be Israel Abanikanda, Chris Rodriguez Jr., Deuce Vaughn, Evan Hull, Zach Evans, Eric Gray, and Amari DiMercado. And starting at the top of this list here, I think for Izzy Abanikanda, the way that I'm projecting him moving forward is it feels like the best bet for him is to be Breece Hall's handcuff. You look at the roster right now, there's not a lot of guys here that are going to be worth any fantasy football relevance. Izzy Abanikanda right now looks like the RB2, but they definitely could address this in the draft and bring in another guy, and that would ruin the chances of Abanikanda being the running back too. That takes me to Chris Rodriguez, the same kind of situation here. I do think he is the best player in this group. He probably showed us the most on the field in 2023 out of all of these guys, but I do think that this is also a guy who most likely is going to just be Brian Robinson Jr.'s backup. I do think that he should see some increased volume in some opportunities and in some touches in 2024, especially because Antonio Gibson has left and went to the New England Patriots. But I still do profile Chris Rodriguez more as a change of pace back or a backup to Brian Robinson Jr. Now moving on to Deuce Vaughn. This is a guy who right now for the Dallas Cowboys currently sits as one of the only running backs on the roster. It's really like Rico Dowdle and Deuce Vaughn. I don't think that is going to remain the same throughout the offseason. I fully expect the Dallas Cowboys to add a running back. We've heard that they might have some potential interest in reuniting with Ezekiel Elliott. I saw that today. They also could be a team that could be drafting a running back here in the NFL draft. So I don't expect Deuce Vaughn to remain one of these guys that has a buttload of opportunity going into the 2024 season, but I still think that there's enough question marks that he might be worth a hold at least until the NFL draft so we can see if they do address that situation. Now, Evan Hull is another guy who I think is probably more on the trajectory of backup running back to kind of handcuff potential territory for a guy like Jonathan Taylor. Now, obviously, Zach Moss was the backup and was the handcuff to Jonathan Taylor in 2023. Like I said, Moss is now in Cincinnati. And now with that happening, it does seem like that running back 2 job is going to be open, or at least open for the taking here in Indianapolis. I think Evan Hull has a chance at getting that job. I mean, you look at what Moss was able to do for this Colts offense last year in 2023. He was 38% of the carries and also 7% of the targets in this backfield. I think somebody is going to come in and eat that up. Is it going to be Evan Hull? Is it not? Not really sure, but probably a guy that's going to be on the fringe of your dynasty teams where if you do think he can fill that role, you're probably keeping him. If you don't, go ahead and cut him. Now going to Zach Evans of the Los Angeles Rams. Right now for the Rams, there are 0 fantasy relevant running backs behind Kyren Williams. So I think he's sitting here by default. You kind of see a theme here with all of these guys. These are guys who are potentially going to find a running back 2 job, a backup job, where they could potentially find opportunity if there's injury or lack of additions to the backfield in their certain situations. I think that's kind of the theme with these guys. That being said, we've seen crazier things happen. I mean, look at the guy who is starting above him, Kyren Williams. People were writing him off and telling people that he should not be rostered in 2023. And look what happened. Let's not make the same mistake with Zach Evans. I'm not saying he's going to be Kyren Williams. Do not hear what I'm not saying. That is probably far from the truth. But Zach Evans, I think he's worth a roster spot at least right now or until the NFL draft when we can see some of the additions that get added in Los Angeles. Eric Gray is another guy who potentially could be a running back 2 in his offense. Maybe even a guy who, dare I say, could push for more touches than just running back 2 backup type of touches. I mean, you look at what they have there in New York. Obviously, Saquon Barkley has left. He's went to the Philadelphia Eagles. Cardinals. And that means that the New York Giants are going to be moving forward with Devin Singletary, who they signed in free agency as RB1. Now, again, this is a team that could potentially look at some additions in the NFL draft, but if they don't, I think Eric Gray would project as the number 2 running back moving into the 2024 season. And if there was an injury or if there was lack of performance from Devin Singletary, maybe Eric Gray gets a little bit more run. But again, this is a guy who's going to be sitting on the fringe of your dynasty rosters. And if you don't have the space, I'm not going to tell you you have to hold him. This is not a guy that I'm willing to die with on my roster. By all means, if you want to move on from Eric Gray, move on from Eric Gray. But I do see a slim little chance that maybe he could get some opportunity in 2024. And now the last player in this tier is going to be Emari Demercado. This is another guy who showed flashes of relevance in 2023. Obviously, he got some run there for the Arizona Cardinals, and I think he's going to be competing for the backup job with Michael Carter. I do think that Michael Carter is probably a more dynamic, more complete type of running back. Emari Demercado feels a little bit more of a bruiser type of running back, but we do know that James Conner is a little bit older. He has a little bit of injury history to him as well. Maybe Emari Demercado is worth a roster spot to you, but if you don't feel like he's worth it either, go ahead and cut him as well. Like I said, all these players are on the fringe of your dynasty teams. And now that's going to take us to the drops. If there's a player that obviously is not an obvious keep or wasn't addressed in the first 2 tiers and is not on this tier, you're safe to drop them as well. But the drops are going to be Sean Tucker, Dwayne McBride, Emmanuel Wilson, Kenny McIntosh, Deneric Prince, Chris Brooks, Elijah Dotson, and a bunch of other guys that we have not mentioned today. These guys, I don't need to get too deep into them. I don't see a path for any of these guys to find any type of fantasy relevant touches in 2024 or even beyond, unless there's multiple injuries in their backfield and a bunch of crazy stuff happens. These guys, you're okay to drop them. Don't worry about keeping them. So now that we got the running backs out of the way, let's move on to the wide receiver position. Obviously, if it's one of the obvious keeps, like I mentioned before, we're not going to mention them. But there is a list of keeps that I want to address. This list is going to consist of Marvin Mims, Dontavion Wicks, Quentin Johnston, Michael Wilson, Demario Douglas, Jalen Hyatt, and Jonathan Mingo. So let's start at the top. Let's talk about Marvin Mims. I think this is a guy who is going to find some opportunity in 2023. You look at Jerry Jeudy, who was traded to the Cleveland Browns. This has opened up about 18% of the targets there in Denver. And I do expect Marvin Mims to at least be leaned on to take up some of that target opportunity share. He was drafted in the second round of 2023. This is a guy who they had high expectations for. And like I mentioned, I do think Sean Payton is going to lean on him. There should be a lot of opportunity for him here in year 2, and we'll see what he does with that. But that takes us over to Dontavion Wicks. Now, this is a player who I think is in a crowded wide receiver room. He doesn't actually have a ton of opportunity, at least from the outside looking in right now, but he is in a room right now with Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, and Romeo Doubs. I think most people would probably project Dontavion Wicks to be the wide receiver 4 in this offense, but we know how good this offense was down the stretch being led by Jordan Love. I think Wicks showed that he could play down the stretch as well. This is also a guy who averaged 8 fantasy points per game in 2023. So definitely a guy that I'm willing to keep on my bench right now in Dynasty Fantasy Football Leagues. Now moving on to Quentin Johnston, and this is a guy who had the opportunity of a lifetime to play with Justin Herbert as the wide receiver 2, especially when Mike Williams went down in 2023. He obviously didn't do anything with that. A lot of people are so disappointed in Quentin Johnston, and rightfully so. But when we thought that the opportunity couldn't get any better for Quentin Johnston, the Chargers go out and they move on from Keenan Allen. They move on from Mike Williams entirely. This is leaving Quentin Johnston as the wide receiver 1 in this room, at least today. Maybe they address it in the NFL draft, but at least today, Quentin Johnston is looking to be the leading wide receiver for Justin Herbert. And like I mentioned, a lot of people have left this offense. We didn't even talk about Austin Eckler or Gerald Everett or some of the other role players that are in this offense as well. When you add up all of the targets that have left the Los Angeles Chargers this offseason, the Chargers have lost 65% of their team's targets that they used in 2023. So they're going to be looking for players to come in and eat into that 65% of vacated targets. That is a massive chance of opportunity for Quentin Johnston. I'm not saying that he is going to be a superstar. I'm not saying that I'm super excited for Quentin Johnston, but the opportunity is there. And I think Jim Harbaugh is going to tell QJ to show up or go home in 2024. And definitely a guy that we need to keep at least for this season on our rosters. Now moving on to Michael Wilson for the Arizona Cardinals, another guy who is going to have some opportunity. Hollywood Brown leaves in free agency. He goes to the Kansas City Chiefs. And now Michael Wilson is sitting at the top of the depth chart, at least momentarily. I do think when it's all said and done, he is going to fit in as the wide receiver 2 in this offense in Arizona. But with Hollywood leaving, That does open up about 19% of the targets. Michael Wilson profiles as a little bit more of a deep threat, maybe a red zone threat for Kyler Murray. It'll be fun to see what Michael Wilson can do as the wide receiver 2 in Arizona with a healthy Kyler Murray for the entire season. Moving on to Demario Douglas for the New England Patriots. This is a guy who had no expectations coming into the 2023 season, coming out of Liberty. He ate up that slot role there in New England. He had a great year from the slot. Now, statistically, it didn't seem like he was going to produce a ton for fantasy football, but let's talk about how the New England Patriots were not a good football team. There's a reason why they're picking number 3 overall in the NFL draft. He averaged 7.7 fantasy points per game, but the thing that I found the most impressive about Demario Douglas is he was targeted on 23.6% of his routes during the 2023 season. I fully expect him to be the slot wide receiver for the Patriots moving forward into 2024, and with a potential upgrade at that quarterback position, definitely somebody that I want to keep on my roster moving forward. Now, Jalen Hyatt of the New York Giants, this is a guy who was drafted in the 3rd round of the 2023 draft. We know that it wasn't necessarily a great year for the Giants, and I don't know if we expect it to be a great year in 2024 for the Giants as well. Daniel Jones is still going to remain the quarterback of this team, but with Darren Waller planning on potentially retiring here this season, that was probably the only guy in this offense that even had any value of any type of receiving targets. You look at Jalen Hyatt now, I think this is a guy who could step up in this offense and be needed if Darren Waller does actually officially choose retirement. But even then, Jalen Hyatt profiles as a deep threat type of field stretcher, and there may be some value in having that on your Dynasty fantasy football teams. And for the last guy in this list, we are going to be talking about Jonathan Mingo of the Carolina Panthers. And again, another very, very disappointing prospect from the 2023 draft. He was drafted very early in the 2nd round of the NFL draft. And I think that Jonathan Mingo is probably a guy that I would argue could be on the fringe, where you may just want to move on from Jonathan Mingo. If there's somebody who believes in your league that will trade you a 3rd round pick or something for Jonathan Mingo, I think I might consider doing that as well. They added Deontay Johnson this offseason. I think that's going to help the Carolina Panthers, but I will say that early draft capital is the only thing that is keeping Jonathan Mingo afloat. And when you look at what he was able to put on his resume in 2023 as a rookie, he had one of the worst yards per route run rates ever from an NFL rookie. So definitely nothing to be excited about for Jonathan Mingo. The draft capital makes me want to hold him a little bit longer, and the age of Adam Thielen makes me want to hold him a little bit longer. But if you want to move on, by no means am I going to make you keep Jonathan Mingo. So moving on to the fringe wide receivers in this tier, maybe they're going to make the cut, maybe they're not. Let's talk about them. It is going to be a list of Trey Palmer, A.T. Perry, Andre Yoshivas, Trey Tucker, Parker Washington, Cedric Tillman, and Charlie Jones. Let's start with Trey Palmer here for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think Mike Evans returning to the Buccaneers dampened probably some of the excitement that we had for Trey Palmer, because I do think that he profiles to fill in that Evans role pretty decently, but definitely a player who still has some upside. Even with Evans on the field, he did see 68 targets in 2023, so definitely things to be excited about for Trey Palmer. Moving on to A.T. Perry, this is a late round guy that I think showed flashes in 2023, even though he had a very, very limited sample size. I think he's a major red zone threat for this New Orleans Saints team. He had 4 touchdowns last year on 12 receptions, so like I said, a very small sample size, but he had a nose for the end zone in 2023. And I think the thing that kind of makes me intrigued with A.T. Perry, where I might consider keeping him on this roster, is that Michael Thomas is a unrestricted free agent. So if he does leave, that is going to open a door of opportunity for A.T. Perry. So now let's talk about Andre Yoshivas, and let's also group in Charlie Jones, because I have both of these guys on this tier because virtually the reasoning why I am considering them as fringe players is the same for both of these players. But Tyler Boyd is a free agent, and there might be somebody in this offense who has the potential to step in and take that kind of slot wide receiver role for the Cincinnati Bengals. And I will say that if I had to bet on one of these guys, I do think that Charlie Jones profiles as the better fit for that Tyler Boyd type of role. But both of these guys may be guys that you consider holding on to just until we see what happens with Tyler Boyd, and maybe even until the NFL draft, where could we potentially see a T. Higgins draft day trade. But I think Yoshivas and Charlie Jones both have potential here as guys who are going to remain on that fringe bubble for your rosters. Moving on to Trey Tucker for the Las Vegas Raiders. This is a guy who I think flashed at times, especially when he was playing in the slot. You look at the Raiders now, who are going to be moving on from Hunter Renfrow. I think that's going to open up at least a little bit more opportunity for Trey Tucker. Definitely a guy that we should probably be holding on to. Now, Parker Washington for the Jacksonville Jaguars, another guy who flashed at times last year, especially later in the season. I think this is more of a guy that is potentially a sleeper to monitor. I don't know if there's a lot to hold on to with Parker Washington. So yes, he could find his way into a role, but if you guys think that you want to cut him from your rosters, you don't have the room for him, by all means cut him, because I do think that with Gabe Davis, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, and potentially a rookie wide receiver, this wide receiver room could get pretty crowded pretty quickly for Parker Washington. And now the last player in this tier, it is going to be Cedric Tillman for the Cleveland Browns. And Cedric Tillman, he did struggle to get on the field as a rookie. Obviously, like I mentioned, they did add Jerry Jeudy this offseason. So now Amari Cooper, Elijah Moore, Jerry Jeudy are the wide receivers in this room. So it did get a little bit more crowded for Cedric Tillman. But I will say the good thing about Tillman's profile is he's the only wide receiver out of that group that does profile as that X type of wide receiver. The rest of these guys don't really profile the same way as Cedric Tillman. So that does kind of have a benefit to his profile because he's unique in that wide receiver room. But I will say that there's not a lot to hang your hat on from Tillman in 2023. And now moving on to the drops at the wide receiver position. Again, if they were not mentioned in the obvious keeps, the keeps, or the fringe roster guys, they are going to be classified as a cut. So some of these guys that we are going to be dropping is going to be Tyler Scott, Xavier Hutchinson, Xavier Gibson, Jake Bobo, Kayshon Boutte, Darius Davis, Raheem Jarrett, Justin Shorter, Ronnie Bell, and probably many more wide receivers as well. Now that is all we have for you guys today. If you did enjoy the video, go ahead and hit that like button. Make sure you guys are subscribed to this channel for more content from Nick, Adam, and myself. Group videos coming as well. And if you guys also want some additional Dynasty Fantasy Football content, make sure to check out my personal channel at the League FFB. I'm posting content on there all the time. I'm sure you guys will love it. I've seen some of you guys come over and comment in the comment section. Makes me so happy to see you guys doing that. Appreciate you doing that. And if you have any other specific questions about specific players that you're considering cutting before your 2024 rookie drafts, throw them in the comments below. I'll try and answer them as they come in. With all of those things out of the way, we'll see you guys on the next video. But until then, peace out.